blockbusting and redlining, which still exists today illicitly, would be the argument against that.
Redlining, if you look at the actual counties which were affected, it didn't take into account things like credit score, income. If you actually look at the data behind redlining, it's just, it's a liberal talking point the same way that blockbusting.
Blockbusting is when, still to this day, real estate agents will intentionally buy a house, move a black family into a white neighborhood, then solicit the residents there to sell their properties because, quote, there goes the neighborhood, and then try and buy the houses on a premium. And then what they do is they buy the house, rent it to a black family, go to all the houses and say property values will go down because a black family moved into your neighborhood. You need to sell to us now. They'll get the property for a premium. Then a year later, they move the black family out, restore the prices up to where they are in the market. This was made illegal in the 80s, but it was a principal way by which they perpetuated this. We still see this today where it is typically recognized as a racist market fact. Like, I'm not saying there's an individual who's racist who hates black people, but you go to any real estate agent and ask them, like, hey, you've got investment properties. What would you do if a black family moved next to your investment property? They're going to tell you they're going to sell.
Yeah.
And they're going to say, look, I've got no problem with a black family. Tons of friends are black, but the market will react negatively to this. So I probably don't want to lose money and I would sell. That concept perpetuates since the 80s. So I don't know how you get rid of this. You know, it's funny because even liberals do it. Like the story that I've told is a woman that I worked with who was this progressive Hispanic woman. She said that she inherited a property in New York City from her, grandpa or from her family or whatever. She was woke, as one could describe woke. And I said, what would you do if a black family moved next door to your property? She goes, oh, I'd sell right away. And I was like, isn't that racist? And she goes, I'm not trying to be racist, but like my property would lose all its value right away. And I'm like, okay, so long as you believe that and perpetuate it, that's going to cause problems to the net worth and like the generational wealth of black families.
Right.
So
it's not illegal, right? And
it's not illegal.
Like stuff like that happens all the time. That's kind of what people describe when they talk about systemic racism. It doesn't take a single individual being like, oh, I hate black people, like throw them in jail, although that does still happen. And that's the other thing is like you talk about like, yeah, it is illegal. Yeah, we did pass the civil rights law, but like, kicking and screaming, half the country was fighting against it. And those people didn't disappear and their kids probably have very similar values. We are becoming more progressive, but the idea that like, oh, well, because it's illegal, it's gone now is just like not borne out. Like these things absolutely still happen. These people still hold these views in a lot of different places. So
of course it is. I mean, if there were any evidence that it were actually happening, even on the individual level, like this is the example that comes to mind. Look at like what happened to Papa John. Papa John literally said the N-word in a meeting, telling employees of what not to say.
No.
He was quoting someone, right?
Papa John said something to the effect of, how come Colonel Sanders said N-word and he got no flack for this?
Okay.
Why is that acceptable? He was condemning that Colonel Sanders used a slur and no one cared, and they used that against him to strip him of everything.
The point being, it's such
maybe
a
I can use this to pivot back to the topic, though. Actually,
any instance of racism, you can file civil suits, you can do whatever. It can become a national media thing. You can get a book tour, whatever it is. If these instances were actually existing, even at the individual level, and so I feel like it's this like game of whack-a-mole, where it's like, oh, surely these things must be being caused by institutional racism, even at like the individual level. Whereas, I mean, maybe we've got the thing with the blockbusting, but there are also things like education, school funding, crime rates, of course, all sorts of different things that we could use to explain the outcomes of different cultures in this country that we can't quite find so precisely with things like institutional racism or even, anecdotally.
But all of those things you just mentioned can be products of the institutional racism, like blockbusting, where it's like, hey, this like entire neighborhood of black people is just more poor because of something that started off as a racism thing, or maybe from someone who was well-meaning, a liberal, progressive, woke person, and yet this is now downstream effects. The property values are lower. That means the school's going to be underfunded. Like this is all like
that's why they get
together.
Funding from the federal government.
They don't. It's like 10%, I think, for like public schools. Right?
On average, I think schools that are majority minority receive like 1% greater funding from the federal government than schools that are predominantly white. Even they even have better credentialed teachers with advanced degrees. They get more funding. And I remember I went down to Cass Tech High School in Detroit because I was trying to do a fundraiser one time, and it was better than my high school, which was in Birmingham Public Schools. It was supposed to be like one of the better districts. And I go down to Cass Tech High School, and I'm like walking in between like crackheads and human feces. And I go into what looks like a Silicon Valley startup building. And I was like, okay, this is like pretty advanced. Yet I don't know how many kids in Detroit schools are literate. So clearly there's something else going on.
I don't know about the, like 1% I don't think is going to make a huge difference. And I could just fire back an anecdote.
At least
I grew up in a particularly poor neighborhood, and I was in like the okay kind of middle of the line mixed school. But all the schools down in Richmond, which is like a notoriously poor neighborhood, were really bad. There's like gunfights, drugs, people getting, I mean, there's literally, I think a movie about just how bad there was, like Coach Carter or something like that. Like these are really, really bad schools. The property values are really low. And these kids, like, they grow up, they don't have anything. They don't have a lot of opportunities. I don't think you can just attribute this to like, well, it's just the cultural thing. But the culture is downstream of definitely things that happen due to them being in these like segregated ghettos, essentially.
I don't know, man. I see.
But I wanted to focus back to the masculinity thing, because you mentioned the Papa John thing of this idea that, like, you know, he didn't actually do anything wrong. I don't think he quoted someone, you know, who did something wrong to disparage that racist guy, right? Yeah. And then the reaction was, let's cancel Papa John, despite the fact that if you look at this in context, this man has no ill will towards black people. This man is specifically trying to call out racism. And I think that's kind of what's going on with the masculinity thing, where you get this concept of like toxic masculinity. I know you covered the Gillette commercial, right? Where like everyone freaked out because it was like calling out men. And like,
it wasn't calling out men. It's
like men
stereotyping
better, right?
and disparaging them.
Right. And like this idea that like the pendulum swing back to the left is, hey, for so long we've seen these bad behaviors, and rather than try to like integrate and like, hey men, like let's fix men as men, it's more of this like, hey guys, like look at patriarchy, look at this, like, you know, the men control everything, the white people are repressing us. And like this idea does alienate people, because you hear this and like you're like, well, even if you're not one of those people, it's like, oh well, why are you being mean to me? Like you said, like why are you pushing this on me? And the reaction of like the concept of toxic masculinity becomes this like, oh, so being masculine is bad, even though it's trying to describe the worst parts of masculinity. It's unfortunate that like people just hear that and they get turned off instantly, and it's like this overreaction from the left that causes an even more overreaction from the right to push them away.
I have a question. How come the toxic masculinity and patriarchy and white supremacy narratives don't exist in other countries to their dominant racial groups? Like in China, how come there's no like left side of their, you know, political spectrum saying Han supremacy is bad and, you know, Chinese people are oppressors?
Well, I don't know specifically much about China. Do they not like lock up dissidents to a degree there? Or?
Oh yeah, it's the point being like, where is their political movement calling out their moral or racial or ethnic supremacy?
I don't know if there is one for like racial or moral. I mean, you can look at
it seems like
the concept of Taiwan or Hong Kong and these people kind of rebelling against the leadership there. But
they're the same ethnic background.
Yeah, I don't.
Taiwan is the original Republic of China. It's a difference of political ideology.
Sure, but I think they consider themselves like different peoples, right? Or maybe I don't know. I'm not like.
Well, the Taiwanese are going to say they're Taiwanese for sure, and China is going to say the Taiwanese are Chinese. My point is, in the United States, the only group with racial outgroup preference are white liberals. Blacks, Asians, Latinos have a racial in-group preference. And white conservatives have a racial in-group preference. White liberals have a racial out-group preference.
You say out-group preference, like if you poll them, they're like more likely to support their community than the party or something?
No, they're more likely to support non-white people.
Okay, and so white liberals are the only group that would support non-white liberals.
So racial out-group, meaning black people are more likely to vote for and support black people. Mm-hmm. Latinos are more likely for Latinos, Asians for Asians, white conservatives for white people, and white liberals for any other race.
Sounds like white liberals are the least racist people.
I would argue that makes them the most racist.
Well, if we're willing to vote for anyone in our outgroup?
No, it means they don't support white people. It means they have a preference.
They specifically have an anti-white bias, you're saying?
Yes. Well, we call it racial outgroup preference.
Well, what I heard from that is like, oh, they're willing to support anyone other than specifically white people, which is kind of what my experience has been in like San Francisco. It's not. Let me be clear. There are people on like the fringe left that are like, oh, fuck white men for sure. But for the most part, it's just like, hey, like I'll support anyone regardless of their politics, and like that's kind of what that sounded like to me, or at least maybe that was me projecting my experience onto what you were saying.
Like progressive activists, one might say, are nuts, but they do hold a disproportionate amount of power among the liberal faction in this country, be it the Democrats or otherwise. And then you see how they implement this in universities and at protests with the progressive stick. If you're a white man, shut up, sit down, don't speak.
See, that's the thing is I experienced that, right, at the SJW college UCSD, right? And I even took a gender studies class. They had like a requirement DEI class, right? So like I thought like going in, I would watch Tim Pool. I would watch like anti-SJW content. And I thought this was going to be like the wildest thing ever. And going into that, it was really just kind of tame. Like sometimes they would say some wild stuff, but it was never like, hey, you're a white man, sit down, shut up. If anything, I was the guy talking in class the most, like because I was the one who was more opinionated. I wanted to have these conversations. I was really interested in like, hey, like this seems like an insane idea. Can I push back on it? Like no one ever like marginalized me for being white. At the worst, there was maybe some rhetoric, but that's kind of like my whole thing about this masculinity thing is, yeah, I get some bad things coming at me, maybe some like mean comments, but that's like really the extent of it. Like I don't feel discriminated against, and like why let that change like who I am and my politics and make me feel like it didn't make me feel like I couldn't be myself in the liberal party.
Yeah, I mean, I would say that I know we all have our opinions and that's our prerogative, but we do live in a two-party system, which is to say that you have to at some point align yourself with whichever party you believe is going to be a better approximation of how you want the world to look. And so I have, complete respect for your opinions and your experience and you aligning yourself with progressives, maybe even voting for Democrats. But the problem is that when Democrats are in charge, whether that be expressly in political institutions or even culturally, you do see that demonization, which maybe is caricaturized in something like a Gillette commercial. But even then, I mean, you can trace this back to growing up and you may not feel like, a mean comment here or there is really like stripping you of some identity.
Thanks for watching this clip from the Culture War podcast. We're live every Friday, 10 a.m. to noon, so subscribe and come hang out.